are often not necessarily associated to the military or to Washington, but you can see this friendship flourishing from their letters from that period onwards. And so it explains, in a way, why this French-American alliance could become more of a success than you could expect from the beginning, where, of course, there was almost no hope for anything. But because of this personal bonds, this individual relationship between a few of these French and American generals and officers, it can explain a part of the success. There's, of course, so much more, but there is this individual side that's often forgotten. And so if you look at individuals, you can realize that friendships are crucial for trust with allies, of course. So there's more, of course. There's an enlightened approach to warfare that I've described very briefly that Chateauneuf was exhibiting already since a young age, that Rochambeau shares with him. They actually realized that the Americans base their ideas, their tactics, their different strategies on French manuals. So they realize that their theories are all not that different. The way they think about war, they think about the army structure, are not that different one from another. So they find a common ground in this more enlightened approach to warfare. And of course they find more common grounds in shared beliefs in especially development. We're in an enlightened age, of course, development of agriculture, of trade, of science, of art, of the growth of this beautiful, for them, what he says, nascent United States. So all these things come from the reports of Chateauneuf that he has kept privately in his archive, but that he also sends to the French army administration and Versailles to show there's actually hope for our alliance. He's writing this to his sister, to who he writes very often, that his mind completely changed by this trip. And of course, those he was traveling with are describing this too, specifically his aide-de-camp, who was Montesquieu. His name is actually the grandson of the philosopher Montesquieu. He's describing this whole trip as a real changer as well. Well, of course, a well-known moment happens in May. So this whole reconnaissance mission led to a lot of reports. Rochambeau is informed of all these missions, what they found. This hope of the French when they returned was, of course, quite high. And at the same time, there is still a lot of, we could say, stress about what is going to happen for our new campaign. We have maybe some more trust in our alliance. We have more trust in the allies we have to fight with, but we still don't have enough people. So in the Wethersfield Conference, of course, which is a known moment where Washington and Rochambeau meet again to discuss their new options, based on the fact that the French have heard that they will not receive more men, but they will receive their naval aid. They don't know exactly when yet, but there is hope for, okay, we can do something together, but they don't exactly know when. The naval aid of De Grasse, that we all know, of course, from the Chesapeake Bay battles, but they don't know when he's coming, but they do know that there is at least hope for something that will happen in the future. So when Rochambeau meets Washington, they're going to make plans to march to New York to see, okay, can we maybe attack New York, or shall we go to the south? And then they, of course, don't know yet that they're going to go to Yorktown, but there's still these two options, as they had discussed already months beforehand. And so they're going to start the march, which, of course, is now the beautiful Washington-Rochambeau National Historic Trail that has been mentioned before. But so they do start a big march where the French are finally leaving Newport to go to New York, to a place called the Phillipsburg Encampment, where they will combine with the Continental Army. So the two forces are combined, and this is the moment when the second kind of phase started of this reconnaissance mission. This is maybe quite well known for some of you. It's called the Reconnaissance in Force mission, but you could consider this part of the same idea of let's do a lot of research before we actually go into action. This is it was a practice that was done before too. It's not a new practice to do what you call reconnaissance in force, is to force the enemy out of their places to see where are they located. So they're pretending a battle. So what the French and Americans do is that they put 5,000 soldiers ready to attack certain points of the Manhattan little fortification area. And then they can see, okay, that's where they're located, and they can really see what will happen if we attack. Then they retreat, and they're going to study the results. This is leading to a lot of reports, but one of the reports is an unpublished one of Chateauneuf that was in his private papers. and it really advises very strongly against attacking New York. He says it must be admitted, he's looking at 5 different options all together, and he's like, it must be admitted that they would require much superior means than those we can and could dispose of. The enemy could make our best hopes vanish in an instant. So, of course, one of the main reasons of this is a research mission. They can understand that if they would attack, that most Frenchmen and Americans would die by doing this attack because they're heavily outnumbered by the British. And so, when George Washington, who was present during these reconnaissance missions, sees that, when he reads the report, when he listens to Rochambeau and Châteauneuf and all these others, the real decision is made to actually abandon this idea. This is a well-known quote, of course, but he's abandoning his ideas of going to attack New York. And so, therefore, I turned my views more seriously than I had ever before done to an operation to the south. So the mind of Washington is now finally going southwards, not only because Rochambeau and all these people are advising not to go to New York, but also because he himself, in his very rational approach to war, sees that it's going to be an impossible mission. He saw this based on the research that the French did for him, but also, of course, on his own judgment, because who would go into a battle where you're just totally outnumbered and you're sure you're not going to break into these fortifications? Châteauneuf played his own role by having a lot of private conferences with George Washington based on all the research he had done. And he had also sent a lot of his reports to La Luzerne, who was the French ambassador, who also played a very sort of behind the scenes role to convince Rochambeau and especially de Grasse to especially not go to New York. There's a lot of background detail that I would need to explain to really make my point, but let me just move on there. How much time do I still have? That's the real question.
You're good. Carry on.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Because I have a whole other story to tell. But yeah, so Châteauneuf played this role really of advising Rochambeau and also Washington on we should do this research, we should really think about this war in more rational ways, we should apply all these ideas of doing research, but also to understand not only the military details that were always studied beforehand, but kind of a newer way of thinking with this enlightened way of we are fighting with an ally, so let's understand this ally. Let's not just sort of jump into something just like that. And so, of course, Yorktown is going on. There's this whole march to Yorktown starts, combined troops. Of course, we were discussing what an incredible logistical operation that has been, to have all the different units from, of course, all the different places in America, but also even further down with the Navy from de Grasse coming. And the fact they all came at the same time and that it worked is, of course, quite the accomplishment. But it's also, of course, based on a lot of preparation beforehand by the French and American forces that were, of course, quite well informed of the possibilities of this march. And so we're going to now switch to another person called Viomenil. So Viomenil and Châteauneuf have the same rank. They're both major generals under Rochambeau. And Viomenil and him work together, of course, on a daily basis, mainly on this whole logistical side of the army. Châteauneuf was in charge, of course, of doing these research missions, but when he was in Newport, he was always working with Viomenil on the encampment, making sure there was food, making sure there were horses, making sure there were tents, all these different elements. And so Viomenil and him knew each other already since the 7 Years' War and had stayed in touch, of course, in the period in between. So they were not necessarily friends, but they were, let's say, good colleagues. And so while doing research on Châteauneuf, I wanted to know more about Viomenil, since I could see a lot of letters from Viomenil and I did not really know who that man was. So a fun little article led me to finding his papers too. Some historians have heard about it, but no one really uses the paper, so it was quite surprising for me to find that out. But in a little journal, there was a reference to a letter of Lafayette. It's a very local newspaper that no one really knows, Le Journal de Saône-et-Loire. And so in 2011, they wrote about one letter. So I was like, let's go and see what that is, because Le Creusot happens to be very close to my parents' place too. And so here the Baron Antoine Duhoux de Viomenil is coming from a place not at all in the same region as Châteauneuf. He's more like on the border side with what today is Germany, in Fauconcourt. And I'll go very quickly through this, but he was a veteran of many wars. way more experienced than Châteauneuf, because Châteauneuf only played a part in the 7 Years' War, but Baron Vieux-Menil started in the Austrian War of Succession and also did Corsica and Polish campaigns, where he fought, by the way, with Choisy, who was also one of these American revolutionary heroes. And he participated in the French Revolution on the royalist side and actually died of wounds while protecting the Tuileries. Okay, let's not go into all these details, but just as a little side note, a lot of his family members were also participating in the American Revolution. There is Le Baron, of course, himself, but then there's also his brother, who was also Major General, so they're very high up, of course, just under Rochambeau. And then his daughter was married to someone who would be his aide de camp. Here's his brother, not talking about him today. And so he also has a daughter who was married to this person who was also a colonel of the regiment Saintonge, and then he had his own son who was his own aide de camp too, just to show there were these families where almost everyone was involved. And so the reason the archives were so sort of separate from the archives you would normally go to is that at one point this man, Mr. Schneider, from a group that some of you might know, the Schneider Electric Group, he just bought a home that belonged to the Vieux-Menil family. I don't know if we could call it a castle, but at least a nice home, where he found archives, and he didn't know what it was, so it was just papers of Vieux-Menil, and he put it in this archive, which is his own archive of the industry, so the metal industry of Le Creusot, that is really focused on just factories. They have just one little collection of the Baron de Vieux-Menil. And of course, since no one expected, no one went there for a long time, and so they've just been forgotten in this place, Le Creusot. Le Creusot is known for this. And so these letters are actually very interesting because they contain a lot of different, of course, periods of his life, but especially also about 1,000 pages on the War of Independence. So his role, and as an addition to the Châteauneuf papers, really creates this corpus of sources that's so interesting to reconstruct the details of the French campaign. And as I said, some people had already heard about this, but I have not really seen references to it in published books, at least. And so this collection opened a lot of other routes, sort of. And so you can see in this collection that the American campaign for him was especially way more the internal side of the French army. So compared to Châteauneuf, who was way more outgoing, let's say, he was always in touch with Americans, going everywhere, meeting everybody. He was more focused really on the French campaign, so he was in Newport, organizing the camp, making a lot of lists of all the different soldiers, and making a lot of counts every week. He was doing these reviews to have everything, which is a wonderful source for historians, because often there's a lack to know exactly how many were they, what were they paying, all these different things. So there's a lot of information to find in his archives. Then there's also interesting information on Yorktown. So I will not focus on all the other things, but specifically on Yorktown, there's about 3 letters that I think are very interesting. That will tell you more about how that went. But so here you can see all these lists. I would say they're extremely boring to look at, by the way, because it just goes on and on with all these numbers, but it's very useful to really know day by day what was going on. There's an order book of Rochambeau that just describes every day of the campaign, very detailed. So at one point you become seriously quite crazy by looking at it, but there is so much information. So for another book about all the details, that would be great. Okay, so going to his role during Yorktown. So of course we were, the whole Châteauneuf thing happened, but then there's of course this whole march. The march is happening. Vieux-Menil is in charge of a sort of division of this march. And so while Rochambeau and Châteauneuf and Washington are already further ahead, he is really in charge of the French units and how to get them to Yorktown. So in September he's around Baltimore, and then Rochambeau writes to him, "The services that you and your brother will render by putting all your care into the embarkation of the army as quickly as possible will be just as interesting as those that we will render by blocking Cornwallis in such a way that he cannot escape us, if possible until your arrival." So his mission is considered, of course, extremely important because the units have to arrive at the same time in Yorktown and have to, of course, participate in this blockade, and then the siege. And so Viomenil's role in the march and making this march happen as fast as he did is a crucial element of the possibility of winning Yorktown, combined, of course, with a lot of other factors, but he is really considered the person that brings the French troops on time where they should be. Not an easy task. There's a lot of lack of food along the way. There's problems with the transportation, so here you can see the embarkation, so a part should be on ships that were not ready, that were all very slow, so it all did, like, it was very complicated, but he did manage to bring the French on time. So he's recognized for that at the time. And today I've seen this in real, this beautiful flag. But Baron Viomenil is recognized here in Yorktown for directing the French army's march to Virginia, first step, but then also planned the assault on Redoubt 9. Okay, so and then a decade, very dramatic sentence, decade after serving the cause of revolution here, he met death opposing it in France. But so what's interesting here is he planned the assault on Redoubt 9. We all know Redoubt 9 and 10. I was happy to be there today to see it, but I'm sure we have all seen it. The two very important readouts that of course led to the surrender. And what is said is that he was the one that was in charge of 9. But if you look at his papers, you see more. So here you can see one of the officers describing about 8 o'clock, Le Général Baron Viomenil attacks the detached redoubt on the left with French troops, and of course the Marquis de Lafayette attacked the adjacent one with the Americans. But so what's maybe less known is that that Viomenil was actually sort of inventing this whole attack of the redoubts, not only 9 but also 10, and that especially, at least I was surprised, maybe some of you know much more about this, maybe Mark, who is sitting there, might already know this, I don't know, but for me it was really a surprise to see this part. The health of Rochambeau having made it impossible for him to supervise the opening of the trench. So Rochambeau was apparently not, at certain moments at least of the campaign, he was actually in his tent because he had wounds that he was suffering from the 7 Years' War of his legs, and then he had fever attacks all the time. And so apparently he wasn't there, and so Viomenil, who had replaced him as best as he could, has judged that from the 10th of October onwards it was possible to remove the redoubts which were covering the entrenchments of Lord Cornwallis. He gave his general, so that's of course Rochambeau, the following memorandum, which will follow after, requesting him to have General Washington approve the execution. The project, which was adopted only of the day of the 14th of October is the moment of the attack, had the most desired success. This is, by the way, translated because it's actually in French that he's writing it himself. And so you can see in his papers that he had written the orders and instructions of the Marquis de Lafayette for the attack of Yorktown. So these are, of course, the command, he's giving the command of the American attack, and he's more recognized for the French attack, but not necessarily for this American attack. I will not go, of course, through the whole quote, but here you can see the orders to Lafayette, where he gives him the sign, which he says, so after a silence of a quarter of an hour from all our batteries, 2 large bombs and 2 shells will be fired tonight at 6:30 precisely from our first parallel, and 2 small bombs from the second. So that will be the sign that Lafayette can go. So this will be the signal that I proposed and that was approved by Washington to bring out the American and French troops that must attack the redoubts on the left and the enemy's great force. And then Lafayette will be on the head of this division. As soon as Monsieur Lafayette is master of this redoubt, it will be occupied by the number of men he believes necessary to defend it against enemy attacks. And then, as soon as Monsieur Lafayette has everything in place for the preservation of the redoubt that he will have taken, he will go to Viomenil, whom he will find in the redoubt taken by the French, so that he can give him new instructions on what he will think best to do for the rest of the night. And then, I like this part, Lafayette will directly instruct General Washington of his success. It is a pleasure that Monsieur Viomenil likes to leave to him. Wow. Viomenil, of course, is older and knows that Lafayette likes the glory of the battle more than he does. Then, of course, he also gives similar orders to von Steuben that is very similar to the ones to Lafayette, which is, of course, also interesting because Steuben had to be part of this whole attack on the redoubt. So he's ordered to have the redoubts and the parallel guarded. So when the Marquis Lafayette is attacking, and then if unforeseen circumstances render the attack unsuccessful, the Baron von Steuben will have their retreat protected by all fighters. So, okay, this is all details that are leading, of course, to these attacks, the very famous attacks on the different readouts, but so Viomenil played a larger role than he is recognized for today in this specific planning and thinking about it, while he was, of course, still participating. In the French redoubt attack, Châteauneuf was also quite crucial. He was also there and fighting and getting that redoubt, leading, of course, to Cornwallis seeing that his situation becomes very critical and that he, of course, had to surrender. And that leads me again to Châteauneuf and Viomenil, who you'll now understand why they're here on this painting and what they have done for the success of the French-American alliance and especially for Yorktown. And one of the reasons I wanted to put an emphasis on both individuals is that new, or at least less explored sources of Viomenil and really the new ones of Châteauneuf that had never been studied are so interesting to put together, to have another perspective and new thoughts, ideas, insights on the French-American campaign. And I'm still working on it now, so I'm excited to continue this, but also to understand so much more details and all these new insights and things I can learn from this period, but also on the battle specifically. My PhD was more on the intellectual side of the revolution and all these exchanges, but I'm getting more into military history now. So it's just an interesting journey through all these different sources that you can find. And to finish, I want to finish with George Washington and the way he appreciated Viomenil and Châteauneuf. So here, believe me, sir, sincere, when I tell you that your amiable qualities, your distinguished bravery, and your zealous exertions upon every occasion have made an impression upon me which will not easily be effaced. Effacé. And so here, this is, of course, the final letter that Washington writes to Viomenil. But then George Washington writes to Châteauneuf as well in the same period and says, I can truly say that never in my life did I part with a man to whom my soul clave more sincerely than it did to you. Ta-da!
Question. When you went to the current owner of Châteauneuf, did he know or realize that all the letters he had from what? He had no idea these were there.
No.
These were unknown letters.
Yes.
Where are they now?
They're in a safe. There's more to say to this, but Philippe, when he inherited the castle, was aware that there were letters that were of importance, but the thing is that they have 700 years of letters. So this is one of his collections. He has collections on the Crusades, he has collections on the Burgundian kings, he has about all the different French kings. He just has so much material. He has a lot about Napoleon, by the way, it could be interesting for Mark here. Napoleon, because his son was serving under Napoleon, François-Jean Châteauneuf's son called Alfred. So there's just so much. And so they did know that they had Washington's letters because Châteauneuf's wife, when he passed away, had copied them and sent them to America, so that was at least these letters. Thomas Jefferson's letters were also known for the exact same reason. His wife had sort of taken care of that, but all the other letters were unpublished, never seen, and has just been kept by the family. And in the end of the 19th century, one of the family members has indexed, classified everything, has ordered that entire collection. So that's very good, especially for me to find these things. But also, so they knew that they had things about Châteauneuf, like François-Jean Châteauneuf, but he had never opened it, so he didn't know. But as soon as he found out the value, and especially, of course, the importance of the letters, he decided to give them to his brother, who's called Hugues, in another home, which is more secure, because the castle is not that secure. And so he thought, okay, let's bring them to him and then make it better. But then Hugues de Châteauneuf then considered his own property, and then a huge fight between brothers exploded. But anyway, that all happened, but what happened then, since then, is that they decided to sell the Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, and Voltaire letters, I think, and then also some maps of the revolution, which they sold on Christie's in 2018, and so now they're at Mount Vernon. Mainly, the Jefferson letters are dispersed in private collections mainly, but all the Washington letters are at Mount Vernon together with the maps that are Actually, there's a very good New York map and a Yorktown map, and Brandywine map were also sold. So they needed some money for, this is not even a joke, but for the roof that was falling. One of these classic stories, but they did that. But the rest is still in private hands, owned by the family. And little anecdote is that they have been approached by, of course, the public archives of France, National Archives, the War Archives, the archives of the Académie Française, of which Châtelet was part. But they've also always decided to keep it private, mainly because they just didn't really trust the French archives, because in 1870, at one point, the French National Archives have burned. And since that specifically, the family was like, we are going to keep this to ourselves. So that's what they do up until today. And we are now working with Mount Vernon to digitize the Châtelet collection and the Vieux-Menil collection, which will all be available online for researchers. Because I think that, of course, I've done what I could with it, but there's so much more to explore in the collection. And little example is that there's like 7 theater plays that Châtelet wrote. This is just an example of things that I have not really looked into, but he wrote 7 theater plays in between 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, where he rewrote Romeo and Juliet, for instance, and he makes it a happy ending, so it's really quite funny. And so these kind of things, they both just survive very happily. So, well, just an example. There's so much more to explore in the collection, and also for so yeah, we're gonna make that available in summer now.
So what were the condition of these letters if they were in this castle? Were they eaten by mice and wet? And
No, I'm going to go back to the tower just because it's fun to talk about this. But yeah, that's always one of, like, you were wondering, but they were in very, very good condition. Oh, so many sites. But it's because the tower that is going to come soon is called the Archive Tower. Here it is, in the middle. You can see it's different types of stone. This was built in the 19th century, but it was previously built especially in the beginning of the 18th century, when Louis XIV, the French king, was asking, or more late 17th by the way, but they were asking for proof of nobility. So this was the moment it became very important for French aristocracy to prove their nobility by their letters and by their older genealogy papers that they could have. So they built specific towers for this at the time to preserve them very well, because of course their whole life depended on it. And so these towers are built with stone that is absorbing humidity in a way that it stays extremely dry and in sort of a stable temperature too. And so that's why it's still today very well preserved. And the letters are dry, there's no mice whatsoever. You can see the ink is totally in the perfect state. There is almost nothing that you can see that is actually so old. So that's really impressive. Yeah.
The collections that are now at Mount Vernon, are they entirely in French, or do your translations accompany them?
The letters of George Washington are all in English, so they're in English. There's one report that I have translated, and what we're doing for that digital project is that they're all, well, it's quite an ambitious project because there's about 6,000 pages, so I'm not sure if they're all going to be translated. But now for the Vieux-Menil, I started to do transcription and translation, and we have decided to do the highlights, like those that are most interesting will be available in translation too. But it's a lot of work. Yeah.
Of course, the general himself was gone in 1788, but with a castle like that, I would have thought his family might have been a big target in the French Revolution. So how did they get through that?
Yeah,
if you have any...
Interesting question. So Châtelet himself, of course, died prior to it, but he had his wife, and especially his wife was pregnant while he died. So when the revolution broke out, she just gave birth, so very dramatic. You can read in his archive, there's a whole part of her as well, and so she's writing about this, that she had to flee the country together with actually the princess, so one of of Versailles, the princess, where she was a lady of waiting for, so they fled to Italy, and actually the entire Châtelet family of the time fled to Italy with some of the royal family members, and so she just left on time, but she had to leave her baby in Châtelet. Actually, she kept him around there in a village close by, and so Châtelet himself, by the way, lived only in a few months in the castle. He was mainly in Paris always, But so she decided to go to the castle to bring the little baby in a farm with all his papers. So she had a very good idea to preserve it all. She of course didn't know where it was going, but she felt apparently it was time to keep all the papers. They have also the very important 14th century tapestry that is now in the castle, had been rolled up and put into one of the farms. Some of their, most of their paintings of the family members are all kept because they put them in different farms. And then they all left the country. And then after they left, the castle has been pillaged and a lot of things are broken. But the most important elements were not in the castle when they were not there. And then all the family members survived, which is very rare. But so when they come back, so this is Chatelu's sort of cousin, he bought it back from someone that had purchased it during the revolution, bought it back, put the family back in, put all these things back, and so that's why a lot of things have been preserved up until today.
Awesome.
Yeah. There's actually a book written by one of the women of the family and how they were escaping and going to Italy. It's really interesting, actually. But that's a long other story.
Any other questions? Amy? Oh, I'm sorry, got a question?
Follow on to that. So how does for a castle that size, what does the family have, what kind of income do they, or how do they get an income to maintain that?
That's very hard, that's very problematic, because what they've always done is to make sure it's in the family and stays with one person, is that they've always chosen the sort of better suited person of the family per generation. So, for instance, now the owner, called Philippe, has been adopted by his uncle because the uncle thought his own son would not take care of it well enough. So now Philippe is the person. Now Philippe actually also adopted his own cousin because he has only daughters, and that's considered not with the family tradition because daughters can marry and change their names. Even if that's not the case today, I had quite a debate with Philippe at one point, like women can change, keep their own names nowadays, but no, that was not for him. So that's the way they continue. Anyway, the estate is mainly standing on a very large forest. They actually still own 1/3 of Burgundy inland. So that's quite a good idea if you want to have it. So he has quite a good income from the forest, but the problem is still that this castle is just falling apart. So as soon as you repair one side, the other side starts to crumble, and then as soon as you do that, the other side again. So he calculated that he needs 6 million right now. So if anyone wants to participate, he did calculate that kind of amount, and there's some help from the state, but totally not enough, of course. And what he's doing to keep the taxes at least low, because you have property taxes based on square meters, so you can imagine that that's large, but that becomes lower if you open it to tourism. So that's why he gives his own tours every day in his castle, which he's now turning 72, so he's gonna give the castle quite soon to his cousin that is gonna take over. And okay, this is going very deep in the family history, but the good thing for him is that he happens to be the son of someone called the Chateau d'Yquem, which is one of the most exclusive Burgundy wines. So he will have his own resources to take care of the castle. So that's good.
It's your sense that there are a lot of castles and families that have papers that some may, relate to the American Revolution across France?
Yes. So Chatelu, of course, was the first I found. Then Vieux-Ménil came kind of as a crossroads, but then I have been digging, and there's quite a few families that still. So the most recent one. Well, I don't know if I should tell, maybe not. But anyway, there's more. So as soon as you start to tell this story in France, people are like, I might have things because I'm the descendant of the, and then they go dig, and they actually do have papers. A lot of the families, though, have given their archives to the what you call archives départementales, which is there's national archives like in Paris, but then there's in all the departments they have smaller archives, and often you don't think of them because they're so small and so far away, and you just don't know that the family happened to have moved totally at a different site. So sometimes there's big surprises in these local archives that are just less accessible, especially, and sometimes it's not really advertised that they have anything. So yeah, you have to go and find out. So there's still, I'm sure, a lot to find, and there is, yeah.
So
as
There's a
soon
lot
as
of
you.
excitement coming up.
Yes. Yeah. The whole thing is because it's very exciting to find, but it's also so much work to then do something with it. So I'm quite reluctant to find the other one right now because the book I'm working on now is already so much sources. So I should finish this one, but then I'll continue my search for sure. Yeah.
When you were looking at Divime O'Neill, did you look at his participation earlier in the war, for example, in Charleston and the first expedition to Newport? Because he had much different experiences in those two than he did at Yorktown.
No, because his specific archive starts in July 1780, and I'm not sure was he part of the Distant campaign?
I believe so.
Yeah, okay, I should dig into that, but it's not in that archive at least. So to have a look at, but it starts in Newport 1780. But who knows? But I did look at his campaign in Poland, which was very interesting because there's this, well, way too long, but it's the first partition of Poland, and he's participating in that sense, of course, by the French king, and he's describing how a tyrant Russia is suppressing Poland, how they're attacking without rights, how they should pretend liberty. So he's
Sounds familiar.
yeah, exactly. And these papers are very interesting because he doesn't express himself at all about the whole cause, let's say, in America. But in Poland, he seems to be extremely inspired by this cause of saving a republic and bringing sort of liberties and all these different things. So it's really interesting to see other papers. But I have not seen. I'm even doubting maybe there's another view manual that is in the Star one, but that would be something to dig into. Good point. I have to see if that's true.